chapter, which is Castro's consolidation and maintenance of power, right? So the next phase of how, now that they're in power, now that they won the revolution, how do they keep this power? All right. So we have to look at how does Castro become slowly, bit by bit, the leader of Cuba. So a temporary government is established by Fidel Castro and the M26 leadership to replace Batista's government. This guy named Manuel Urrutia, becomes the president, and this guy named Jose Ramiro becomes the prime minister. And their cabinet has some members, former members of the M26, and Castro is appointed the commander in chief of the armed forces. So there's this misconception that Castro comes in and he's like the leader right away. No, not yet. Okay. The Office of Revolutionary Plans and Coordination, the ORPC, was established to oversee the rapid and efficient implementation of Castro's proposals and policies and all of that stuff, such as land reform. And so this was also made up from his former guerrilla leaders like his brother Raul Castro and Che Guevara. The implementation of the ORPC established a dual power government system in Cuba, but by 1959, Miro resigns from his post as prime minister and Castro replaces him. By 1959, in April, Castro and his brother, go off to visit other Latin American countries to kind of meet leaders because, they're part of the new government of Cuba to represent them. While they're away, the president, Urrutia, basically bans and closes all the brothels and the casinos in Cuba, because of corruption and all that stuff. And all of a sudden, all of these people are out of jobs, and that angers the people, and they start protesting against President Urrutia. Castro comes back, and he's like, "What the f just happened? Why did you do that?" And he, without a doubt, opens them back up, and he says, "We're going to keep these open until we can find alternative jobs for the people." This shows two things in early 1959. One, that there was tension between the young radical people like Castro and the more conservative people like President Urrutia within the government. And two, Castro was a decision maker. He was not going to have a debate about this because he felt like this was right and that's it, right? So with that in mind, this kind of makes Castro starts to paint the narrative of like, oh my God, is Castro a dictator, right? And so we will be looking at some things that kind of make him feel as if he was. So in the following months, the Cuban government establishes the National Institute for Agrarian Reform, the INRA, and this office is supposed to, again, oversee agrarian reforms, and they only answer to Castro. Within a few months, the INRA absorbed the ORPC, and basically it becomes Cuba's actual real government, the one that's calling all the shots, and not so much President Urrutia. So some of the former members of the M26-7 and some anti-Batista groups kind of complained about this, and they were kind of complaining as like this is going in the way of communism and this agrarian reforms and all of this stuff. And while President Urrutia labeled those people who left the government as traitors, he did take the time to kind of warn the Cuban people of like, hey, we don't want to go in this communist way, okay? This provoked an internal struggle in the government between the president and the prime minister, Castro. Castro shows his political genius, though. He resigns as prime minister, and he announces on television that the reason why he's renouncing is because President Urrutia is refusing to implement policies that would help Cuba's poorest population, and instead would place people that were pro-U.S. and that would serve U.S. interest. It worked. It worked just, and if it reminds you of Nasir, yes, it reminds me of Nasir a lot. Castro got the reaction exactly from what he wanted from the people. They started outpouring, they started protesting and demanding that the president Urrutia resigns, which he does. Then he is replaced with President Osvaldo, and he works better with Castro and has a better relationship with Castro. And he stays president until 1976, and then Castro replaces him. And Castro stays president until 2008. Next one. So the consolidation of the revolution by December 1960, Cuba was on its way of just having just a single party state, right? And Castro just being the leader of that. So On April 1959, elections were canceled. Political parties were also banned for at least 4 years. Newspapers and radios were censored, and any newspaper and radio that argued against the government was banned as well. The communist-led trade unions were growing in power. All judges in Cuban society were not appointed, but approved by Castro. All legislative and executive power landed on the hands of the cabinet in the cabinet of that was appointed by Castro. Sorry. Next one. So with that in mind, I know the cancellation of elections sounds like a very like dictatorship type stuff thing to do, right? But this was only supposed to be temporary, only because, and the excuse was to allow Cuba to consolidate the achievements that they had made through the revolution. If they had not suspended the elections in the parties, counter-revolutionaries backed by the US posed a big risk in undoing all of that progress they had made. So again, I know it sounds a very dictatorish move by Castro, but a lot of historians and political scientists actually agree that that was a smart move and it's a justified move for a good reason. And it sounds very off for us. It's like, oh my gosh, suspending elections. Understand that's not what we have, is not the norm. Okay. Castro would not allow political parties, most of which had armed gangs. They were roaming around freely and corrupting the police and the military and all of that stuff and weakening the defense and the national security of Cuba. Castro could not have that happen because he needed to restructure both the police and the army to secure Cuba from any attacks, such as the United States, which he was right eventually. We'll see that. Additionally, political parties had a strong relationship. A lot of them had a strong relationship with the United States, and a lot of them in the past had been easily bought out by US corporations and the mafia. If you remember in 1952, during the election that Batista was running, he was in third place, but the mafia was trying to buy that election and buying out other politicians to step down. What makes you think that wouldn't happen again, right? Just because the revolution happened, the United States is not gone. The CIA still had agents in Cuba that were consistently sponsoring US back coups in other parts of Latin America, and were trying to do the same thing in Cuba, and so they were working with those parties. So what makes you think they wouldn't do that again? So again, this is why historians and political scientists justify the suspension of those elections, and they see it as a smart thing, even though his opponents are like, nah, that's not good, that's not good, which you can make that argument if you want to, but you also have to be realistic about the conditions of Cuba during this time. Next slide. So in 1963, the ORI becomes the United Party of Socialist Revolution, and eventually that turns into the Communist Party, the PCC, in 1965, which is led by Castro, by that time the undisputed leader. By that time, Cuba's pretty well stable now, and they can deal with opposition through a democratic means. So bringing back political parties and, not necessarily having to ban all of these things. There were some situations, though, that Castro was still dealing with his opponents in a very repressive manner. In 1968, when he had some members of the PCC arrested for opposing opposing himself, when he critiqued the USSR for being a little bit weak. By 1972, Castro's unlimited power was reduced by sharing some of his roles with other members of the executive branch. Despite this, though, Castro remained the spiritual figurehead of Cuba, and that symbol only grew with time as the United States attempted to get rid of him and destabilize his country more and more and more, especially when you start to see the embargo of Cuba put in place. All right, that's all.